Good morning. We are about to start. We're just waiting for the others to log in. Thank you. Good morning, and thank you for joining us for the Austrade 2020 webinar series, International Development Business Opportunities. This is session one, Leveraging on International Financing Institutions or IFIs Opportunities webinar. My name is Sheila Trans, and I'm speaking to you from Austrade in Manila. Before we get started, I just like to take you through to a few quick housekeeping items. To reduce background noise, all microphones will be muted during the webinar, apart from the person speaking. Please note that audio quality may fluctuate during this webinar. At the end of the session, the panel will be taking questions. In order to ask question, you simply type your question in the space provided as shown on this slide and address this to me, Sheila Trans, and I will cover as many of those questions as I can during the Q&A session. If you have a country-specific question from today's webinar, please include the name of your country in your question. If we run out of time, we will revert back to you by email after this webinar. Please note, Austrade is recording this webinar session and may make the recorded version of the webinar, including all audio and visual elements, accessible to internal Austrade staff and general public via the website www.austrade.gov.au and other communication means Attendees who are not in agreement may exit the webinar now. To deliver the welcome remarks, I would like now to introduce Ms. Elodie Journey, Australian Senior Trade Commissioner and Minister Councillor, Philippines and Micronesia. Elodie has been managing our Austrade Manila office since 2016, promoting international trade, investment, and education. Prior to Manila, she held appointments as Trade Commissioner to the UAE, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, and Singapore, and also a Senior Export and Industry Advisor in Melbourne, Australia. Prior to joining Austrade, she had 6 years working in private sector, leading international sales into the Americas, Europe, Middle East, and South Korea. Over to you, Elodie.
Thank you very much, Sheila, and thank you to all of you for joining us this morning for the first session under our 2020 webinar series, International Development Business Opportunities. These webinars are really aimed at equipping you with a deeper understanding of international development, sharing with you what the key international financing institutions or IFIs are funding, the type of commercial opportunities available, and practical advice on how to access these opportunities. International development continues to be a valuable alternate channel to emerging markets for Australian private sector and academia, as it provides a level of transparency, governance, and aligned interests that may not occur with direct in-country procurement. Opportunities exist across the entire project cycle, as our speakers today will explain. Australia is really well placed to participate in international development projects thanks to our geographic proximity, proven track record, our knowledge and understanding of regional needs, and our expertise in relevant sectors. As an example, Australian firms won over 1.67 billion Australian dollars worth of ADB contracts since 1966. There has been a number of changes in recent times in international development, mainly due to the fact that you've got shifting needs of recipient member countries as they move up the development chain. You also have technology becoming more embedded into development projects. There's a greater emphasis being placed on equipping member countries with the latest expertise, the latest solutions, which quite often resides outside of the IFIs. So the IFIs are actually ramping up their engagement with private sector, whether it's be to access that expertise or whether it's in terms of co-financing. There's also a greater emphasis on ensuring the sustainability of those programs beyond the end of the funding, and also having more of a performance bond. Also, we're seeing, obviously, with a global pandemic such as COVID-19, that's also obviously shifting priorities. And actually, DFI will be presenting on a webinar session tomorrow, specifically looking at the international development response to COVID-19 and some of the procurement opportunities associated with this. So all in all, it's really timely for us to be having this seminar series, first with DFI today and tomorrow, and then we'll have a whole series of webinars with the Asian Development Bank later on in July, which Sheila will share more details with you at the end of this webinar. Now, I would just like to take this opportunity to formally thank Mr. Dave De La Cuesta and also Ms. Diane Tan from Development Finance International Inc., DFI, for delivering the webinar presentations today and tomorrow. Just a little bit about DFI. So DFI is an international business development advisory firm providing strategy for execution approach to the private sector in emerging markets. Founded 28 years ago, DFI has delivered more than $3 billion in contracts and funding across diverse sectors in the areas of sales and market entry and sustainable supply chain. DFI's team of multidisciplinary experts is dedicated to driving business growth and achieving results for their clients across Asia, Africa, Latin America, Central Europe. To date, DFI has worked with a high number of Fortune 500 companies as well as SMEs. So now I would like to hand back to Sheila to formally introduce our DFI speakers for today. Thank you.
On to the sessions. Our main speakers for today are Mr. Dave De La Cuesta and Ms. Diane Tan. Dave De La Cuesta is the head of Asia Operations Development Finance International, Inc. With 10 years at DFI, Dave has extensive experience in over 20 countries, implementing programs to identify and analyze international funding flows, build out qualified sales pipelines, conduct thought leadership campaigns, and implement capture strategies to convert leads to revenue and partnerships for DFI clients. Dave has delivered workshops to client field staff on emerging market business strategies, procurement, and PPPs to support sustainable business growth in Asia. He also leads the expansion of DFI's network in Asia, including with the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, UN agencies, bilateral donors, and government agencies. The second speaker is Ms. Diane Tan. She is manager for DFI. Diane works in the areas of higher education, science and technology, public health, and e-learning. She also specializes in market development, acceleration strategy, and implementation to expand sales and increase visibility of private sector partners in Southeast Asia, South Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa. For over 7 years, she had led comprehensive assessments of national programs led by the government and international financing institutions, and identified actionable opportunities for DFI clients with the aim of growing the sales pipeline and scaling up pilot programs to IFI engagements. Over to you, Dave and Diane.
Thank you very much, Sheila, and it's a pleasure to be introduced. It's pleasure to be here. Good morning, everyone from Australia and in other parts of the world. It's our pleasure to be here. Next slide, please. Okay, so as Elodie referenced, we have specifically designed this session to provide you with tools to maximize the opportunities that are being provided by IFIs. IFIs provide a lot of opportunity sales for Australian companies. And what they're trying to do today is to provide you with first an understanding of why it's beneficial, or what are the advantages of engaging with IFIs, what types of business opportunities are available, but more importantly, how do you pursue those opportunities? How do you identify those opportunities? And how do you eventually, speak to stakeholders, talk to ADB to further understand and pursue the opportunities for your company? So we'll be dividing the session into two parts. The first part will be led by my colleague Diane. She'll be discussing a little bit about the IFIs, first and foremost, the types of funding they are providing, which sectors they are being focused on, and then I'll be continuing the discussion onwards with the discussion on how to pursue them and how to identify the opportunities. So from here, I'll pass it on to my colleague Diane to discuss IFIs. Go ahead, Dee.
Thank you, Dave. Good morning, everyone. To start off, I would like to introduce our firm, DFI, Development Finance International. To give you a brief overview, DFI is actually based out of Washington, D.C., with the regional office for here in Manila, Manila, Philippines, and we have partners in Japan, Ethiopia, Brussels, and in other parts of the globe. We have been in the business for over 30 years, supporting the private sector understand the collaboration opportunities presented not just by the government, but also by the IFIs. We are hired by reputable companies to help secure business, whether by large Fortune 1000 companies, and in some instances by small to medium-sized enterprises with support from their trade agencies. So on this slide, you will see some of our reputable clients. Most are of long-term partnership, which includes Philips, who is now known as Signify. There's BASF, there's Mars. So far, we have closed $3.5 billion across the globe and across sectors. And this is through following our disciplined approach and proven models, which have provided our clients with 30 to 100 times ROI. For the next 30 to 40 minutes, what we will provide are our experiences and insights resulting from our 30 years of experience and how the model has been proven successful. I'll also be sharing some of the IFI trends that we're seeing that I'm sure you'll be finding helpful as well. Next slide, please. So who are the IFIs and why should you be interested in IFIs? This slide is a map of where each IFI's headquarters are. We have the multilateral development banks, which are ADB in Manila, World Bank in Washington, D.C., African Development Bank in Tunis. And we also have the bilateral entities, which are USG's USAID. We have Japan's JICA. We have UK's DFID, as well as large private foundations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, who is a large player in the health space. Combined, they have an annual average of $200 billion across sectors, and this is to help achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs, which all of the countries and institutions have committed to achieve by 2030. They have provided a lot of funding for projects across sectors. These are projects for development challenges in high growth markets. And what this means for the private sector is that there is opportunity to sell your goods or your services, consulting opportunities, in order to help the IFIs and the countries achieve their project objective. Next slide, please. So IFIs are just actually more than funding. Number one, they have a convening power. IFIs work with the government, with the NGOs, civil societies, and developing country partnership frameworks and projects targeted to address development challenges in a country. So what this provides you is the opportunity to actually meet the relevant stakeholders essential to your objectives in the priority country that you are in. Second is policy making. So because IFIs work on similar projects across multiple countries, the governments are open to replicate best practices, listen to the IFIs on what their experiences have been in implementing similar solutions in similar challenges in other countries. So for example, what the private sector can provide in this side is to share their experiences on what has worked and what hasn't in other countries. For example, in the health sector, the topic of universal health coverage has been on the table for many years for developing ASEAN nations. Topics that the IFIs would guide countries in might include, like, let's say, barriers to market, insurance, income sources, or the medical policies, the drug policies. So if you have experiences in these types of challenges or in these types of solutions, then what would be best for you is to get engaged with the IFIs leading this type of work in the UHC space. Third is access to funding, and what I mean by this is private financing. More than development projects, IFIs also develop private sector funding mechanisms. usually on innovative financing mechanism that would address challenges like supply chain, trade finance, and project financing to scale projects in frontier markets. Lastly is industry expertise, which means that the countries are always listening to the IFI's advices on specific challenges. Sharing your technology would be the best way for IFIs to actually promote your solutions in ongoing projects or perhaps in upcoming projects that would still be designed in the next few years. Next slide, please. In addition to those mentioned, what I would like to highlight are specifically that IFIs have programmed and budgeted projects. What this means for you is IFIs adopt a code of transparency, and by this code, the private sector would have a systematic way to gather information that's relevant for you. All stakeholders are provided this information publicly through their websites, and this would help the private sector easily understand and get information publicly. So by reading all of these documents, publicly available documents, you would be able to confirm how much budget there is in the project, what's the timing of the opportunity, and what is the opportunity to scale. Would there be upcoming projects that would be approved in the next medium term or long term? What this also means is that there are bigger scale contract values versus other opportunities in the market, like if you would be going alone into the country. Of course, there's also international procurement standards. So MDBs or multilateral development banks like ADB and the World Bank adopt a similar procurement mechanism. They have the oversight on how money is spent in the projects as agreed with the recipient governments. So what this means is that the governments need to follow the IFI standards of transparency and accountability in procurement. If there is questionable transactions, then there will be rules to follow to address these challenges. The set de facto standard and meaningful game-changing challenges. What this means is that by nature, IFI support frontier markets in tackling developing challenges. The private sector would have the opportunity to develop pilot models for these types of solutions and be able to set policies for new issues and help carry the risk. If you are successful, then these pilot projects would set the de facto standard in future implementations, which provides you a first mover advantage in the country. So this means that in implementing future projects, they would have the preference to actually work with you, and you would be able to scale and grow your presence in the market. Next slide, please. So now that I've been able to share some of the benefits of working with the IFIs, I will share more information on the priorities and solutions of leading IFIs to give you a clear understanding of their solutions. This will be made available to you after the webinar, so you can take a look at more information and be able to ask some more questions as well. So the Asian Development Bank is the premier bank in Asia Pacific. They have committed over $23 billion in 2019 alone, which will be made available to member countries in Asia Pacific. So this is from Afghanistan to the Pacifics for the next year or 3 to address development challenges. This actually comes in the form of sovereign loans or grants. So loans meaning the governments could borrow this and be able to pay back in 20 years or so, or grants which are no strings attached for the countries. This actually doesn't include the so far $20 billion committed for COVID-19 response, which we will be discussing more of tomorrow. In 2019, also, ADB was able to finalize or disburse 745 million contract size for consulting services, or about 7% of the total contract that was closed for goods, civil works, and consulting services in total in 2019. By investment space, these are the breakdown of where the funding went to in 2019. For transport sector, some of the solutions or some of the services that were needed included planning and design, integrated transport system or ITS, smart cities, climate change adaptive infrastructure, as well as engineering or civil works for project design and build. In the energy space, there were more on solar power, scaling renewables, large-scale energy storage, smart grid, solar off-grid, and climate change financing. Geography-wise, 31% went to South Asia. South Asia includes India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Maldives, and then 30% to Southeast Asia, which are the ASEAN nations, and then Central Asia, Central and West Asia, which is Uzbekistan, Georgia, and Pakistan. I would like to note that this percentage does not mean prioritization. It just means that in 2019, more funding was negotiated and needed by these countries, and there were more uptake in infra requirement, I would say, in these regions. Next slide, please. So for the World Bank, they have been supporting about 189 regional and non-regional members across the globe. They have a commitment of $62 billion in 2019 and about $9.5 billion contracts in value for goods and services. Out of this, there was about 17% or $1.6 billion dedicated for consulting services. By investment, 14% goes to energy, which have been their priority sector because they have been supporting a lot of the emerging economies in scaling renewables. This could be hydro and solar, as well as energy efficiency solutions. Social protection is also up on their list, which includes health, rural health facilities, and primary healthcare, as well as in education, which includes primary to secondary to higher ed and to TVET. Curriculum development is also one of the key items that they have been prioritizing over the past few years. Geography-wise, 1/3 of the investment in 2019 went to Africa and South Asia and Latin America. So who you would want to engage with at the World Bank would be the communities of practices. If you have solutions that are relevant or game-changing in these areas, you would be interested to get engaged with the communities of practice, or these are the informal groups of sector leads who regularly organizes some of the brown bags or some of the best practices sharing to internal staff of the World Bank. So if you are able to do that, then you would be also able to put your brand on top of their minds in developing their projects and implementing in ongoing projects, which would also provide you downstream opportunities for potential sales. Next slide, please. So for the next two slides, I'll briefly touch on these banks. One is AIIB, which is relatively new. They are based out of Beijing, China. And so far, they have been prioritizing their funding for infrastructure, more on sustainable infrastructure connecting the countries and the borders. And in 2018, about 50% of their projects have been focused on infrastructure like roads and bridges. They are also very keen on private capital mobilization, especially for the energy space, energy and infra space. For COVID, they have actually raised about $10 billion in commitment to be made available to member countries as sovereign loans and grants, as well as to the private sector that will be made available for the next year or so. Next is, of course, the Australian government's DFAT, or the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. DFAT is very active in 27 countries from the Pacific to Asia. And one of their key projects are actually in Pacific and Timor-Leste for infrastructure financing facility. This is about $500 million that will be made available from 2019 up to 2023. Next slide, please. USAID is the US government's agency for aid. They are active in providing capacity building, financing health commodities in over 139 countries across the globe. Most of the projects are actually implemented by US firms. So opportunities for Australian firms is actually to partner with US firms to implement some components of the projects that would be right up your alley. So this might be on emergency response, food security or agriculture, education, and the others on, let's say, more on health and family planning. Lastly is JICA, or Japan's agency for international cooperation. They are actually very much active across the globe, from Latin America to Sub-Saharan Africa to Asia Pacific. Most of their projects in Asia Pacific are really targeted for infrastructure. Most of their projects in Africa and Latin America are more on poverty reduction or social programs, as well as in agriculture. So the only caveat for JICA funding is that you have to be a Japanese firm to actively participate or bid in consulting opportunities. So for Australian firms, the advice would be to actually partner with Japanese firms in order to capture some parts of the revenue from those opportunities. Next slide is how to pursue IFI. So I'll be giving this to Dave, and he'll be leading you on the practical advices on how to pursue IFIs.
Thank you very much, Dee. Next slide, please. All right. So now that we've discussed the benefits of doing business with IFIs and have had a brief overview of how much funding there is, which is a lot, even the smallest sector that the ADB or the World Bank are funding is in the billions of dollars. So, I don't see it to be very insequential that 1% for example, healthcare is, bill in the millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars. So I think every sector is very important to them. So now that we've had that understanding, I think our clients usually ask us, so that's great to hear. That's, it's interesting to hear how much funding there is, but I'm a business entity. So what I need to know is, what is the opportunity for me? When is it coming? How much is the budget for it? Who is the customer? Who is the final decision maker? Is there enough budget? And finally, does my solution fit? So you resonate very well with these questions. And what we'd like to do in the second part of the discussion is try to give you some tools on how to answer these questions. There's been a lot of misconception about, the difficulty in getting this information. Some people, some companies, for example, wait to attend an ADB seminar or talk to an actual ADB or World Bank project officer to ask these questions. But I'd like to emphasize that a lot of these answers to these questions can be answered remotely or by reviewing certain documents that we'll walk you through. And that would enable you actually to take advantage of and maximize the limited time you will be able to have with the ADB eventually, or with the World Bank when you actually meet them or be able to speak with them over the phone. So we'll walk you through, and hopefully by the end of this presentation, you'll be able to answer all of these questions on your own, and validate it with the relevant stakeholders moving forward. So first, let's try to answer what is the opportunity. Next slide, please. So in order to answer this, I think what we need to do is understand two very important types of projects that define who will be your decision maker, who is your customer. So I will be discussing two types. The first one is technical assistance project, and the second one is an investment loan. These two types of projects, I would say, combine for about 80% of the total projects of IFIs, especially World Bank and ADB. The other 20%, those types of projects are a little bit more complicated to discuss, that we can of projects that you need to be aware of. So first is the technical assistance project. Technical assistance projects provide a lot of opportunities for consulting firms. There are two types of technical assistance projects. One is a transactional technical assistance that you see to your left. And basically this type of technical assistance is meant to prepare a future project, a future investment loan. So for example, if the Philippine government is requesting for a loan, for example, for education, to build schools, then the ADB or the World Bank would issue a technical assistance project to help the government design what type of project could be made, what type of interventions could be done, or a feasibility study, if you may. So these projects are meant to prepare a future opportunity or a future bigger investment loan. The second type of technical assistance to your right is a knowledge and support technical assistance. This means that the end product, end result of the technical assistance, it stands on its own. It's not meant to prepare a future project. It's meant to be a knowledge document, perhaps even a policy advice, or in many cases actually landscape studies on a particular subject area that the World Bank or the ADB or other IFIs are providing in general to all their member countries. So we make this distinction because of two things. Number one, and most importantly, if the project is a technical assistance project, the final decision maker or your customer is actually the ADB or the World Bank project officer themselves. So you can talk to them with an expectation that they are your customers. So you can talk a little bit more about the specific budget, the scope, and your credentials. There's an expectation that they are the purchaser, the decision maker, so you can discuss more specifics. Now, the second important distinction, that's why we divided the two types of technical assistance projects, is because you need to be aware, especially for a lot of companies that can provide not only consulting services for a feasibility study, but eventually for the follow-on project. For example, in the case of a transactional technical assistance project, where there is a follow-on opportunity downstream. If you are aware that this consulting scope is leading towards a future scope, you may want to review which opportunity you'd like to pursue, because there is a policy against doing both the preparation of feasibility study and actually doing the project itself, the downstream project, because of conflict of interest, right? Because if you did the design conceptually, you have conflict of interest if you're also going to do the construction, for example, in engineering, right? So if you are aware that it's a transactional TA, our advice is not to pull away of the opportunity. Our advice is to confirm or validate with the relevant decision maker at the ADB if this is in fact in conflict with the downstream opportunities. They may tell you it is in conflict, and therefore it's up to you to decide which one you'd like to pursue. You may evaluate the budget between the two, or the timelines between the two opportunities. But it may also happen that they would say there is no conflict at all, right? And you can pursue both. So our advice is to first identify if it's a transactional TA, and then validate with the relevant ADB or World Bank stakeholder if there's any conflict. If not, then you can pursue. All right. So again, in summary, if it's a technical assistance loan, your customer is the World Bank, the customers in the ADB. They are either in headquarters in Manila or in Washington DC, or in the World Bank or ADB country offices in the home countries, in Vietnam, in Indonesia, and other developing member countries. Next slide, please. So the next type of project is an investment project. These types of projects are typically the large investment loans that you see that the IFIs are funding. Technical assistance grants or loans could scale from 5 million to $10 million. Investment projects are in the somewhere between 50 million to $500 million. So in terms of scale, these are much larger projects. These are loans that are provided to the government. Now, the distinction is with these types of projects, while the ADB and the World Bank are providing the funding, right? You see here the funding flow. It flows from the IFI to the government, to the ministry, but because it's a loan, the government is in fact your decision maker. They are your customer. So even though the ADB is giving the money, who you want to convince of your solution is the government, regardless if it's a consulting scope, if it's a goods and services scope, they are your decision maker. I think that's a very important distinction, because if it is so and you're speaking to the ADB, you have to recognize that the ADB is not your customer, and you don't have to sell your solutions to them necessarily. What you can do is validate the information, validate who is the decision maker, who is the customer from the government, who are the consultants designing it, and then it will be eventually the ministry the Ministry of Education, if it's an education project, Ministry of Health, if it's in the health side, um, up to the beneficiaries, including the universities who will be actually doing the procurement. They will decide what type of solutions they will buy for under this project. So that's very important distinction to make. Um, I also one thing I'd like to point out: consulting contracts can happen in both. Consulting contracts, of course, are primarily the mode of intervention on a technical assistance project. In an investment loan, there are still needs for consultants and technical and advisory services. Again, the difference is if it's in an investment loan, your decision maker is still the government, even if it's a consulting service that you are providing. So that's a very important distinction to make. So in this case, you will see tenders would be for laboratory equipment, consultants are still needed, and even quality assurance standards are still required. Later on, I'll go to a specific case study about this so we can visualize what types of information we can gather. So next slide, please. All right, so now that we've discussed the two types of projects, I'd like to briefly run you by the concept of project cycle because it's very important in identifying when we should engage. The first we try to answer is what are the opportunities. Now we try to answer when you should engage. So this is how a typical project cycle works with an IFI. First, they create a country partnership strategy that takes them about 3 months. A country partnership strategy basically identifies the key sectors. It's negotiated between the IFI and the government, and they identify key sectors that they want to support. So for example, they would decide we want to prioritize health, energy, maybe transport, and that basically creates a framework of the funding and support they'll be discussing. Once that's done, they proceed to an identification phase where they would identify specific projects that are needed in the identified sectors. So for example, if education was selected, then they would review, okay, so what types of projects can be funded in education? What's the need? What type of solutions can be rolled out in the country. So that identification phase takes about a year, and then it transitions to a preparation stage where they actually prepare project documents for approval. It's like a loan, right? So they need to create justification for the project. So under this stage, in the identification and preparation stage, a lot of consulting firms are required either to do feasibility studies, right? Or sometimes in many cases, they need to also review environmental hazards and metrics. They want to ensure that projects are not harming the environment in any way. Of course, that goes as well to social issues. For example, displacement of communities needs to be evaluated. So there's a lot of opportunities here in this space for consulting firms. The key here, that's why I framed it in this way, is to engage a step before your opportunities, that you have time actually to prepare and pursue those opportunities. So for example, if you're a consulting firm that you are interested to pursue projects in the preparation stage, you want to identify projects in the country partnership strategy or identification phase so that you have time and the opportunity to position yourself for that opportunity. Okay, so now once the projects are prepared, it's submitted to the World Bank and ADB board of directors, and it's submitted for approval. Once that's approved and accepted by the government who applied for the loan, it goes to an implementation phase. The implementation phase usually takes 5 years. It could be longer if there's some delays in the project implementation. Over the course of 5 years, they would disburse the total funds of the project. If it's 500 million, they would disburse the 500 million over 5 years. And this is where majority of the procurement happens. They would then, under this phase, they would procure consultants to actually design more specific interventions like curriculum, for example, in education. This is where they would hire engineering firms to build roads, to build buildings. So this is majority of where the interventions are procured. Next, after the 5-year period, they would go into an evaluation phase for projects that are already done. So in this phase, they review, what worked, what didn't work. So there's still some opportunities for consulting firms, particularly for monitoring and evaluation. Not as much as in the identification phase or implementation phase. But what we advise our clients is also to review some of these, projects that are already finished for potential learnings. For example, if you're pursuing a project in healthcare and you want to propose a new alternative, right? You can actually review projects in this stage to see if that topic that you want to promote became an issue in the other projects. Because if it did, then that gives you an evidence, or that gives you a talking point on why your solution could be able to actually address some of the challenges that were faced in a previous project that they implemented. So um, so this is the project cycle. Again, the key here is to engage a step before, or even two steps before your opportunity comes up, so that you have time to prepare. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we discussed what is the opportunity and when you should engage. Okay, so now we go to the details. Where can I find these opportunities? The good thing is it's actually available. Much of it is available online. This is a snapshot from the ADB website. The World Bank has a similar page as well. We have included links at the end of the presentation so you can check them out. Although I would advise it's very easy to just navigate the website and check for them. So this page from the ADB website is actually very easy to navigate. You can filter by country, by sector. You can search keywords. So it's very easy to search for opportunities that you're trying to pursue. So next slide, please. Next slide, please. All right. So once you select a project, just for example, let's use this as a case study to show you how can we answer the questions I laid out earlier in the presentation. So in this case, I picked one country or one project specifically in Vietnam. The project is University of Science and Technology, Hanoi. They're building a new school. You will see here in the project page, the total project cost is about 190 million actually for the project. So 170 plus $220 million. Okay, so this doesn't tell us much, but if you see there's a tab called Documents there, and if you click that, that's where a lot of the information could be available. So if you click that, let's go to the next slide, please. You'll be able to see these four major documents, especially for investment loans or projects that are already approved. You will see their project administration manual. You will see the reports and recommendations to the president. This is the proposal that they submit to the board for approval. You will see a procurement plan where they lay out all the purchases that they want to do, including budget, and you will see the loan agreement. So on these documents, by the way, are very long. Some of them could go up to 250 pages, 300 pages long. So you don't have to read through them verbatim. What I provided you on the left side of the screen here is the key questions that can be, there are key sections in the document that has this information. For example, you would know the status of the project, if it's approved, the budget, the total budget for the project, objectives of the project, which should be very important later on. I'll tell you why. The duration, components, the overseeing the project, the government stakeholders in charge of overseeing the implementation, and the planned procurement activities as mentioned. So if you review this thoroughly, ideally, this is what you will be able to gather from reading these documents. Next slide, please. You'll be able to actually paint a picture of the project, including the opportunities that you're interested to pursue. So maybe let's start with the bottom part of the screen. You see the select procurement. So this is from the documents that I've highlighted in the previous slide. You could actually identify immediately. There's a $75 million contract for a construction package scheduled for Q3 2019. So including the timing, the budget and the timing, you would be able to get here for laboratory equipment, right? For supervision, the advisory services for project management and supervision for construction, and they would even hire consultants, right? For procurement specialists, or sometimes they would have hire consultants for curriculum development. So ideally, this is the type of information that we can generate. It can be summarized in a page or two. It's very important for private sector to understand that you can actually get this information from there. So this will be the basis of your business strategy. You can form actually a business strategy, 2-year business strategy based on this, based on the amount of packages that will be available, the timing of that, and of course the country in which they are operating in. The project details on top of the objectives will be very important when not necessarily to you as initially as a company trying to sell, but it will be eventually very important when you're trying to justify why your solutions are the best intervention for the project. So I would advise you to take note of that, because you want to ideally align your solutions to the objectives of the project. That way, you're not selling a product, you're selling a means to achieve project objectives, and that would actually position you much better and would give you much more credibility with the institutions rather than just selling a product. So next slide, please. In addition to these information, you can actually also understand a little bit more about the decision-making process in country. In this case, from the ADB, the fund money goes to the Ministry of Finance, to the Ministry of Education, to the specific university. And then it mentioned in the project documents that Dr. Dean Tate Mai Tan, from the acting president for the university, is actually the decision maker. So that's very important to find out. So we know he's a decision maker. What else is important is to understand who are the influencers, who are the stakeholders around your decision maker, because eventually, if you're trying to convince someone, it's very helpful to understand who the advisors are, who are the stakeholders influencing that decision. So not only the decision maker, but the influencing points around them. It can be consultants, or it can be um, other stakeholders included in that process. Next slide, please. All right, so let's now go to tips and best practices on how to pursue projects. Next slide. All right. So this slide is not from me. This is from the ADB. So if take their word for it. So and thankfully, I think we've been able to address at least the first two topics. They are advising you to gather all pertinent information prior to engaging them, because that maximizes the opportunity, right? So instead of asking the ADB what is the opportunity, how much is the budget, you can actually go further than that and discuss your solution. So the discussion can be geared towards more about confirming what you already know, and then going further and positioning your solution for that. So they advise gathering information ahead, engaging early, and then they would also advise you to conduct meetings with the ADB in a productive manner. And this is the advice they give. Be prepared to talk, of course, in technical terms, understanding the project objectives. That's why it's very important. The details on timing, implementation. But also very important, keep ABB's priorities and interest at the forefront. This would, give you more receptivity from them. So when you review project documents, it's important to understand what they're trying to achieve. So if, for example, they're trying to decrease malnutrition, you need to brainstorm of ways on why your product or your solution is able to address that. Maybe in a cost-effective manner, maybe in a manner that would address theirs or meet their objectives much faster than they initially anticipated. So I think the discussion needs to revolve around why you can help them. And from their perspective, I think you might be interested to ask, right? Why would the ADB be interested to talk to me about these types of opportunities or products and solutions? So for them, I think what we need to realize is, the ADB and the World Bank, they want their projects to be successful, right? Because if the projects fail, they don't achieve the objectives, of course, the ability of the governments to pay back the loan is also reduced. So they want the projects to be successful. And they realize that in order to do that, they need to listen to private sector ideas, solutions, right? And review them. And if they like them and they think that you're adding value, they can actually introduce you directly to the government. And that gives us so much more traction when negotiating. Because, of course, when you introduce by the World Bank and they see the valid reasoning behind your proposal, then it gives you so much advantage in terms of credibility. In the next slide, I'll actually discuss how I do my meetings with the ADB, assuming I know about the project opportunities. So we'll run you by them. But before we go there, I'll send some quick tips about, especially for SMEs, because I know that a lot of SMEs are interested to pursue. So we can discuss that a little bit. Next slide, please. All right. So particularly with SME, some advice from my end, but actually this advice goes across the various sizes of companies, but especially I think important for SMEs. If you want to engage with the IFIs, I think it's very important, again, to engage early, but specifically what I want to highlight is that for consultancy services, which are usually the ones that SMEs are pursuing, the turnover, the timeline for procurement is very short. The smaller the contracts are, the shorter the time frame for response is. So I've seen actually consulting contracts with 3-day deadlines, 4-day deadlines, 5-day deadlines. So if you're a small firm, right, it's very difficult to respond. You're very acting very actively to opportunities. So if you know the opportunities ahead of time and you can position for them, you can actually prepare your resources and prioritize your time and your projects. You cannot if you cannot pursue 20 projects at a time, you can prioritize them based on the fit, based on the budget, based on the country, and that gives you so much bigger chances of winning than acting reactively, monitoring the ADB website for new tenders. It's very difficult to be reactive. Also, it's important to identify the needs particularly for SMEs. The size of the project usually is a barrier because they would usually ask for prior experience. So, for example, if the contract is $20 million and they would require you to be able to provide that much worth of prior experience, and it becomes more difficult. But if you know that ahead of time, again, pointing to the fact of being early, you can actually look for partners who can, augment your capabilities. If you can position your particular niche and the packages towards a more partner, you have time to look for partners and so on and so forth. So that also increases your chances of winning. Whether that partner is another Australian firm or a firm from another country, then at least that gives you time. And then lastly, we would advise a commitment of about 18 to 24 months, just because some of the projects are first and foremost slow to move in many cases, and also at the same time, from our experience, it takes that much to actually learn. If you don't get it the first time, you learn from it, you adjust, right? So from our experience, it takes about 24 months to really be successful in it. So if you're not successful immediately, I think we advise for you to try again at least for another 18 and 24 months. So it needs commitment. Last slide, please. Next slide. All right. So this will be sorry, previous slide. All right. So this will be my last slide. And I just like to run you by how I frame my meetings, or how we frame our discussions with the ADB or the World Bank, to take advantage of the time, because it's actually very difficult to get more than an hour with a project officer from the World Bank and ADB. So again, instead of wasting that time asking about budget, about the timing of the project, we should already know that ahead of time. And this is how I would frame it. I would frame my discussion. First, on top there, I would do a very brief introduction about my company, 2 to 3 sentences. A lot of companies tend to be very excited about their company, and they spend 30 minutes introducing their company. What I would suggest is keep it brief, and go to the next point, because that's where you would actually catch the attention of the project officer. So 2 to 3 sentences about the company. Say, this is my company, this is what we do, and then say, I've read the project, I've read the PAM. You can reference the project documents. That gives you brownie points to them, because they know you did your homework. I read the documents. I've read that this is how much budget there is for the project. I know this is the objective, right? In particular, on going to number 3 there, in particular, I am very interested about component 2, for example, about curriculum development, because this is a particular interest or expertise of ours. So you zero in on your component. And then from there, lead in with questions. You can say, I noted that this is how you want to address the challenge. You would hire consultant, or you would, for example, hire consultants to do this certain type of work. Have you considered my approach, or this type of approach, referring to your expertise, right? So you're leading in with those questions, and then once they answer that, right, you can go to your ideas. They can say, oh, I haven't considered that, and from there you can say, okay, so this is what I have in mind. And then from there, again, confirm receptivity and interest. And then that's when you can share case studies. Finally, validate roles and key contacts for the projects, and then of course next steps. So I'll end it there, so that we have enough time for question and answer. But I think the slides will be available anyway afterwards, so you can review them in more detail. All right. So Sheila, any questions?
Okay. Um, okay, many thanks, Dave and Diane. We'll now kickstart with the Q&A session. I will start going through some of your questions we have received, but please go ahead and continue to type your questions so the panel can respond. And sorry, may we also invite LOD to join the Q&A? Okay. So let me start with some of the questions. This is a question for David from Sophia Boko of John Stock. What is the procurement process for feasibility phase of projects for ADB projects, for example? Are these advertised on the normal ADB procurement sites?
That's yes, that's right. It's publicized in the what you call CMS, Consulting Management System by the ADB. I think there will be sessions actually moving forward that Austrade is setting up to discuss those, how to register as well. But those are there. What's difficult actually is not identifying the tenders. It's available, but identifying them ahead, right, before they are published, identifying what when they will be publicized. So I think the project pages or the documents I shared earlier would be able to help you identify those projects even before they are published in the CMS.
Okay, thank you, Dave. Another question from Steve Morton, Department of Environment, Water and Natural Resources. Can David advise if the project cycle is ongoing or only happens once at a certain point in time? Another one from Steve. How does the project cycle provide for new innovative technologies and solutions to be identified and supported? Or is there a bias towards traditional solutions?
Absolutely. Thank you. So those are very good questions. The project cycle is continually going on. It doesn't stop. Every country, especially in the country partnership strategy, they identify several projects. So not all of those projects are approved at once. So every day, every quarter, they're reviewing new projects, identifying new projects. So it doesn't really stop. It's continually going on. Now, when it comes to the solutions, identifying innovative solutions, I think there is a lot of interest, certainly. And I think it goes in two phases. Number one, in the preparation phase, where consultants would review what type of interventions could be made, but also specifically also even in the implementation phase, a lot of the interventions in the design phase are actually very broad. So, for example, they would advise this is the intervention, build schools, right, or improve curriculum. But in terms of improving curriculum or buy better equipment, right, that could be the in general intervention. But when it comes to actually specifying how do you define better equipment? How do you define better curriculum, right? Those types of more specific innovative approaches are also decided during the implementation phase. What happens is the ADB and the government would hire consultants to study or prepare specifications for particular solutions ahead of purchasing them. I also think that what we referred to earlier about understanding the project objectives and the development challenges they're trying to achieve. I think if you're trying to promote innovative solutions, if you can align your messaging towards that, I think that would go a long way in terms of them listening to you and really considering your proposal for an innovative approach.
Uh, we have so many questions, but we're out of time. So, um, last question. For newcomers, it's a challenge to win IFI project contracts as the bid requirement insists prior IFI experience. Do you have any suggestions on how to overcome this challenge? Last
Right.
question.
Right, sure. So that's certainly a challenge. I think two things. Number one is if you know ahead of time, you can look for partners um, ahead of time. If you're actually near the threshold, speaking to the ADB or World Bank project officer actually helps a lot. A lot of these prior experience requirements are not set in stone. And actually, what I would advise is if you can discuss with ADB ahead of time and share with them your proposal, your new scope, they can actually cut off for example, if you're in a niche area, right? And you were able to convince ADB to work with you instead of them buying a $500 consulting scope. Maybe they could break it off and split it into two. One specifically that you can address, right? So instead of a $500 contract, they could maybe issue a separate contract, maybe 400 and 100, and then the 100 could be easy. It could be more, addressable to you because that's it's a smaller scope. So I think the early engagement helps you prepare for that a little bit in terms of convincing them on the packages, on how they are structured and how they are budgeted for.
Okay. So, unfortunately, we ran out of time. However, we can see those who have questions which we haven't answered today. We will share this with the panel following the webinar. But also feel free to contact the panelists using the contact details on the screen. May we also invite you to session 2 tomorrow, International Financing Institutions COVID-19 Response Packages. It would be tomorrow, Wednesday, July 1, 11 o'clock AEST. You may still register online. Also, may we invite you to another upcoming event. This will be an exclusive 3-day webinar series for Australian companies and organizations with ADB. It will focus on their 2 operational priorities, OP1, reducing poverty, which will cover education and healthcare, and OP4, which will cover livable cities. We will also have dedicated sessions on ADB procurement and new areas of cooperation. This is tentatively set on 28 to 30 July 2020. Kindly expect an invitation from us shortly. Thank you all for participating in today's webinar. A copy of presentations will be available on Austrade website. See you all tomorrow. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.